Hi, everyone. I'm Mahabali from the American University in Cairo, and I'm so proud to introduce to you Audrey Watters. Audrey is someone whose work I've been following for more than 10 years now, maybe 20 years. I don't know how long. But I have to say that thanks to Audrey, I had a foundation about thinking critically about education technology in general. And she doesn't say educational technology, she says education technology, and to thinking critically about the agendas behind technology and how it gets into influencing education. And if it hadn't been for me following Audrey's blog, Audrey's work, Audrey's books, she has many really good books, I would not have been ready for this AI moment with ChatGPT. And for a while, Audrey had stopped writing about AI in education, but we're so happy that she's back. And we're so happy that she agreed to come and talk to us because she is a very popular woman and it would have been really hard to get her like next year. So I'm so glad she came. I'm so happy that we're starting with your keynote, Audrey, so that we all have this foundation of how to question things about educational technology. And I love the title of your keynote, sort of what do we as educators get wrong about technology and what do technologists get wrong about education? And I know you've helped me uncover a lot of sort of hidden curriculum and hidden agendas in this area. And I'm so glad you all get to listen to that. I'm gonna keep track of the questions in the chat to be able to ask them to Audrey later. So if you have any questions, you can say them in the chat at any point, but she will answer after she finishes talking. And I'm gonna stop talking so she has time. This session is being recorded, and so inshallah, the recordings will be available later. All right, take it away, Audrey.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me to speak to you this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever or whenever you are. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm probably going to talk at you for about 30 minutes. And then as Maha said, I'm hoping that we've got enough time to have that I can answer your questions at the end. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Audrey, do
There
you
we
maybe want
go.
to stop and start it again? See if, oh, there we go.
Oh, here
There
we
we go.
go.
Yeah, there we go.
I'm just seeing a lot of things. But yeah, okay, now it's good.
Now can you see my slides?
Yay,
Okay,
perfect.
cool. So yeah, now I actually do have to start with an apology for real. I was going to start with just the sort of a general apology, right? I think it's actually a fairly common rhetorical device for speakers, right? That we start off by saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to test my slides," or "My Wi-Fi might not be working," or "I have a bad cold." So I do think it's fairly common to start off by apologizing. And I would add, for Americans in particular, I think we do, and I would say we should, come to an international gathering full of apology, full of sorrow, even seeking atonement, perhaps, for many things, for many things. But right now, at this moment, I think for Donald Trump, and I would add for Silicon Valley. So I want to start with an apology for all of that and more. But I really also want to start by to express my own, I think, deep sadness, far more broadly about what's happening in Washington, D.C. Because I feel as though, broadly speaking, things are not good on the planet. Perhaps not anywhere, but I think particularly in education. This isn't new, of course, right? I think education has always been in crisis. It's always been a contested site. And I think that crisis language is often invoked to do some pretty terrible things, right? And so I want to admit that there's a crisis, and I'm also hesitant to talk about crisis because I do think that many people like to use that language, I think, to actually further destabilize education, particularly public education. I think education is maybe inevitably a site of great promise, so much hope, and then also great disappointment. But I also want to say that I'm sorry that I'm going to spend the next like half an hour or so talking about artificial intelligence, right? At the outset of a conference where I'm willing to bet that almost everyone in every session is going to be talking about artificial intelligence, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. And I want to recognize that up front. And although part of the problem that education is facing right now is AI, a big part of the problem is also all we're talking about is AI, right? It's not simply that artificial intelligence or AI might be a grave threat to traditional practices, although I think it is, or to knowledge or democracy, although I think it is. But all we can talk about is AI, and that means that we're often not talking about a lot of other really, really important issues. And I think it also, sometimes that makes us think that if we're all talking about AI, then everyone must be talking about AI, and everyone must be interested in AI, and everyone must be sort of in agreement that AI is the future. And I would argue that I don't think that that's actually necessarily what's happening at all. I think that we tend to get in our sort of circles and in our communities in which something becomes a topic of discussion. And if we step outside that, if we step offline often, we'll find that I don't know that everyone is quite as taken with AI as I think certain people tend to be. And so at the outset, again, I'm sorry, because right now I'm going to talk about AI, and that makes me part of the problem. So what do folks mean when they talk about AI in education? And I think a lot of the time, and again, I'm at fault here, no description, no definition is ever offered. You're just supposed to know what AI is, what it does. You're supposed to know the story. What people talk about when they talk about AI, this is an echo of the short story by Raymond Carver. And one could argue, I think, that there's very little room, ironically, for discussion of what it means. You can say that maybe it's because it's so complicated, we don't want to talk about the technical accounting, and that would bog down our story. But the problem is really, I think, often when we talk about AI, we're really not being asked to understand, we're sort of asked to just be in awe, right? And by awe, I mean both intense admiration and intense fear. That talk about AI is actually not supposed to foster understanding. Indeed, actually, when the phrase was coined, right, by computer scientist John McCarthy, he talked about, he said towards the end of his life, he said, I introduced the term artificial intelligence when I wrote the proposal for the Dartmouth Summer Research Workshop. I had to think of a name to call it, and I called it artificial intelligence. Later, Donald Mitchie used the term machine intelligence, and in my opinion, that would have been a better choice. So even the word artificial intelligence, right, it wasn't a label to describe a science. It was like a word, a clever phrase used in a grant proposal, right, to catch the eye of a philanthropic funder. And that phrase continues, I think, to be a really powerful marketing speech. And in fact, to sort of talk about it technically, AI is a lot of different research areas within computer science: natural language processing, machine learning, expert systems, neural networks, machine perception, predictive analytics, computational linguistics, robotics. So AI signals something very powerful, but it also sort of obfuscates what's going on technically. It's a phrase, I think, that remains useful in some ways because its meaning is overdetermined. And I think that that's important to remember. So when we talk about AI in education, we're often talking about ideology, perhaps even more than technology, right? So when AI means whatever people want it to mean, it's suddenly been slapped onto a lot of new products within and outside of education technology. All of a sudden, everyone now is doing AI. And in fact, they're maybe not doing anything differently, but it just becomes a sort of signal of something quite powerful. And I think we give it a lot of power as well, particularly when we say things like AI is going to change everything. So in his book, The Moral Codes Designing Alternatives to AI, Alan Blackwell defines AI as the branch of computer science dedicated to making computers work the way they do in movies. And I love this definition. I think, there are technical definitions, of course. OECD's is 11 pages long. But even that sort of reflects the political talk about AI as much as the technology. But I love Blackwell's definition. It's short. And I think, but it also underscores what I want you to take away, which is that this is a cultural artifact as much as it is a scientific breakthrough or even a tool. This is a story, right? This is a story that we've bought into. And when we talk about education and AI, I think what gets highlighted is the story, is the way in which we're sort of talking about fantasies of robot teachers and push-button classrooms, fantasies that are quite old. When we talk about AI and education, we're telling stories. We're talking about science fiction. We're talking a lot about speculative work. We're talking about mythology. And in my work, I've done a lot of research on the history of education technology and the history of automated teaching and the history of fantasizing about automated teaching is very, very long, at least 100 years old, more than 100 years. We've been imagining that we're going to come up with this future in which machines do the teaching. And I think it's important to remember that the history of AI is actually very long too. People tell the story that somehow sort of ChatGPT appeared magically on the scene in 22, like Athena bursting out of Zeus's head, just arrived fully formed. But of course, AI dates back to John McCarthy's research proposal in 1956. We're looking at 70 years of artificial intelligence. This isn't an all of a sudden arrival of something that's arrived out of nowhere into our institutions. And I think it's important to recognize too that artificial intelligence has been in schools since the beginning of artificial intelligence, right? Dartmouth summer research workshop was held at Dartmouth College, not the quaint little town of Dartmouth in Devon, England, where A.A. Milne's son, Christopher Milne, who was, I'm going off on a tangent, Christopher Milne, who was Christopher Robin, had a little bookstore there. That would be a very cute story for the origins of artificial intelligence. But no, Dartmouth College, right? The first people who gathered to talk about the creation of this new field, many of them were professors. They were all men. But the connection between AI and education goes deeper than simply academics working at the field. There's been a very long history of people in AI building tools for educational purposes, intelligent tutoring systems, automated essay graders. I think it's important to recognize that people at the outset of the field, not all of them, but a few of them, were interested not just in teaching machines to learn, but interested in that sort of understanding how humans learned and thinking about computers as a model to help us understand that, right? So Seymour Papert, for example, one of perhaps the best known people in the field of education technology, best known for his books Mindstorms and The Children's Machines. He was also the co-director of MIT's AI lab. He co-authored with Marvin Minsky I think, influential and paradigm-breaking book Perceptrons, which sort of introduced the first AI winter. So I think it's important to recognize that there were people interested in education at the outset. And I'll quote Seymour here because I think that this is an important thing to remember about that history. Seymour wrote in 1980, in most contemporary educational situations where children come into contact with computers, the computer is used to put the children through their paces, to provide exercises of an appropriate level of difficulty, to provide feedback, and to dispense information, the computer programming the child. So this was 1980, right? Seymour Papert's vision was at odds with this. He was very interested, in his words, in the child programming the computer. But even by 1980, right, we already had such a powerful way in which the field of AI was thinking about education that Seymour felt he had to sort of fight back about that. Really, a decade before he published this book, the first intelligent tutoring systems had been introduced and were already widely or fairly widely adopted even before the sort of spread of PCs. Carnegie Learning was a company that emerged from Carnegie Mellon. And it still remains one of the most widely used pieces of educational technology software in the United States. Thousands of schools still use this software, although until recently it's been packaged, I think, as personalized learning. And I think perhaps it's worth thinking about what changed recently that made us switch our language of how we speak about this, right? Because the words have changed over the years. But intelligent tutoring systems have been around for a very, very, very long time. One of the reasons I think why it's remained so popular, both as an object of research and as a story to tell, is the paper written by Benjamin Bloom in 1984, the 2 Sigma problem, the search for methods of group instruction as effective as one-on-one tutoring. This is probably one of the most well-cited articles in education studies, in education technology studies to this day. And I think what we talk about when we talk about AI in education, even at the higher education level, often references this specific article, right? And so Bloom argued that tutoring represents the best learning conditions that we can devise, one-on-one tutoring. He argued that tutors could raise test scores by 2 full standard deviations. That's the 2 sigma in statistics speak. And for those who, like me, whose background is humanities, who aren't familiar with statistics, 2 sigma, 2 standard deviations is a lot. That's a big jump. That means moving a student from the 50th percentile to the 98th percentile. It's the equivalent of like 1 full year of learning in elementary school. It's like life change. This is a life-changing transformation that Bloom said one-on-one tutoring could have. And if it sounds too good to be true, perhaps because it was, right? It's not to say that tutoring is ineffective, but no one has since then has ever been able to replicate this finding. I think a lot of more recent studies have found that the average effect of tutoring is 0.37 standard deviations, which translates to a 14% improvement, which is still very impressive, but nowhere near 2 standard deviation. But people still cite this paper all the time. But as Bloom observed, while one-on-one tutoring is the best, it's just too expensive for societies to bear at large scale. And of course, that is a moment in which the technology industry likes to appear and say, aha, but we can solve this for you, right? And so the promise of computer-based instruction has for a very long time been solving this 2 sigma problem for decades now, right? I mean, at least since 1984, but even before then, computers have come in and said, we are going to be able to improve education by giving every student the equivalent of a tutor. And I think that it's important to recognize again, when we talk about AI in education, that this is what we're talking about. We're talking about cost savings. We're talking about making something more efficient. And we're talking about a labor issue that is solved through automation. And in some ways, that also means this is about austerity. This is about reducing the number of humans we employ and substituting an institution's human capacity with a technological capacity. This is what Bill Gates talks about this is what the Gates Foundation talk about. They point to Bloom's two sigma and say that this is the claim, this sort of rationalizes sort of move to have more computers in the classroom. And I think that that's also important to recognize when we talk about AI in education, we're often talking about the past, right? Although we like to think we're talking about the future, we're talking about the past. We're talking about over 100 years now of imagining robot teachers. We're talking about 40 some odd years since Benjamin Bloom published this story. And now, thanks to generative AI, I think we will be further stuck in the past as these models are trained on the past and are really just reordering, statistically predicting and rearranging words from the past. One can predict in a few more years, Stanford University's Professor Patrick Suppies wrote in 1966. In 1966, he wrote this to promote his version of computer-assisted instruction. Millions of school children will have access to what Philip Macedon's son Alexander enjoyed as a royal prerogative, the personal services of a tutor as well-informed and responsive as Aristotle. We love this story. Man, if I had a nickel for every time someone said that that computers were going to be like everyone having their own personal Aristotle, we actually know very little about Aristotle and Alexander's relationship. That does not stop anyone from imagining that Aristotle was an excellent teacher. I find it hard to imagine that Aristotle would have modeled any kind of progressive pedagogy, and yet this is sort of put up on the pedestal as the pinnacle of teaching, a Greek philosopher who from over 2,000 years ago. Saul Kahn, in his recent book that he wrote about ChatGPT and education, said, if Alexander was struggling with a concept, I can imagine Aristotle slowing down for him. If Alexander had a knack for understanding military tactics, I'm sure Aristotle would have sped up his instruction or gone deeper. By having one-on-one attention of Aristotle, Alexander never felt stuck or bored. And this is such an imposition of our ideas onto a situation that really is very unlikely would have matched anything like that. I mean, it's ludicrous. It is ludicrous to compare Aristotle to a personal coach. But of course, I think technologists very often, do not let historical accuracy get in the way of a very good sales pitch. And I think, when we talk about education is fantasy. It's often science fiction. I am not alone in having this dream, Saul Kahn continues in his book. The science fiction writer Neil Stephenson wrote about this in his book, The Diamond Age. And I think that brings us full circle back to Blackwell's quote, right? The branch of computer science dedicated to making computers work the way they do in the movies, to science fiction, to invented histories, right? To novels, to invented histories of ancient Greece, to invented histories of what teaching was like in some sort of, I don't know, idealized past of the elite. And I think that that's we're thinking about whose fantasies are these? What sorts of stories are we being told about AI? And the other piece, I think, is what we're not talking about when we talk about AI, right? That is the Raymond Carver short story, if you're familiar about what we talk about when we talk about love, is a short story in which the protagonists ostensibly are talking about love, but it's not a story about love. It's a story about talking about love. It's sort of about the things that don't get talked about. It's also sort of this story about the things that are supposedly universal, but are so deeply personal and almost impossible to define. But it's also a story about violence. It's a story about threats of violence and about silence and about death. And I think again, what we aren't talking about when we talk about AI in education is very, very important. And even within what kinds of AI we aren't talking about, particularly since the sort of hype around generative AI. There's a lot of AI in education. As I said, we've got, as long as there's been AI in education. But the sort of new hype around generative AI, around these different large language models and the chat interface, is really making us not talk about a lot of other AI in education, in which the stakes are also very, very high. We aren't talking about facial recognition technology that I think has been proven to be racist. We aren't talking about how that works in test proctoring and which students are harmed by this software. We aren't talking about course recommendation algorithms, again, a form of AI, again, that have biases that perhaps do more harm to students. We aren't talking about learning analytics. We aren't talking about foreign language translation, what that means in terms of different kinds of knowledges that may be represented or not represented in the corpus that machine learning works on, and the things that get misunderstood, right? We aren't talking about the algorithms that are used in hiring. We aren't talking about things like Google search or even the whole productivity suite that for a very long time has had a lot of artificial intelligence built into it. Automated essay graders, plagiarism detection software, social media monitoring, college counseling algorithms, in the US, student visa revocation, financial aid programs, how that affects students and parents getting loans based on their credit scores, student retention predictions, lots of ways in which artificial intelligence, AI, is working in education, and I would argue is working to reinscribe and obfuscate harms that are happening to students. But I think a lot of the talk recently has been about generative AI, talking about students and essay writing, in particular, the promises or dangers in research. But we aren't actually talking about a lot of other important issues in education. We aren't necessarily even talking about the ways in which AI has already demonstrated to cause harm in education. So yeah, I'm sorry. There's been a misunderstanding. It was the title I originally gave to the conference organizers, and I opened with my apology, and I just want to sort of say a few things about the second sentence, about understanding and misunderstanding. I think understanding is, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says that understanding is a protean concept in philosophy, right? And the desire for understanding is ubiquitous. It's pervasive in our everyday life. In fact, that entry in the encyclopedia is like 12,000 words in length. And I think that suggests that this idea of understanding is an incredibly complex and rich area in philosophy and in psychology. It's bound up in our ideas of epistemology, what we know. It's bound up in our ideas of ontology, in being, right? In our theories of cognition, in our values, and in the ways in which we think about the transmission of knowledge, and also, I think, shared establishment of truth. And I think that in Carlo Parada's really excellent book, Plug and Play, on the platformization of education, he talks about understanding as something that is intertwined with how we experience the world, about how communicative tools and technologies shape our understanding, how they provide a model for thinking and acting in the world. And he asks, I think, a very important question, which is how do education platforms, right, the sort of rise of education platforms in the last decade or so, how does it change our ability to understand? Is there a possibility that what we are building here is a new way of knowing and understanding that is associated with digitization, automation, and predictive governance of the world? And I like that question a lot. Are platforms changing our ability to understand? Because on one hand, I think it makes us think about the ways in which AI is changing our ability to understand, generative AI, perhaps, but it's not simply about AI. It's broader. This is something that we can't just look at AI. This is sort of wrapped up in a lot of other digital technologies and a lot of other practices that have been going on for quite some time. So we can't just focus on AI or the future of AI, that we have already, I think, education has already been permeated by these platforms that have baked into them a lot of the things that we might see AI as sort of a symptom of the sort of larger practice, right? And so what does that mean? That these platforms, these technology platforms, are already in our institutions, and that they already have been, I think, shaping, controlling what and how we know. And I think that this question of, is this a new form of understanding, is particularly important now that the platforms are heavily invested in automation. Because I think what's happening is an acceleration of the data extraction that we've seen, of vast increase in the computational power, an obsession with scale, but also, again, I think that things are becoming harder to see. There's an obfuscation behind the algorithms. And I think we have to ask, is this a new way of understanding, a better way of understanding, or perhaps are we being faced with new ways of not being able to know things? What might we actually be reinscribing old misunderstandings intentionally, even, right? An automated thoughtlessness. And I think there are many ways in which the technology industry, broadly speaking, as Ma said, has sort of misunderstood education, has misunderstood teaching and learning, right? It has encouraged efficiency at the expense of sort of the messiness of humans. It has privileged instantaneity, right, over contemplation. We're told now that everything must be the feedback must be instantaneous. There's really no space in this model for slow, contemplative thought. It's privileged product over process, right? It's really given a lot of strength to individualization, personalization, at the expense of community, at the expense of solidarity. And it's really prioritized data over humanity. It's reduced almost everything to a transaction. It's reduced almost everyone to a data point at the expense of some sort of deeper, I think, and longer practice that education has sought of understanding what it means to be human. I think it's fixated on scale at the expense of the planet. And I think at the end of the day, the cause of a lot of our problems, it's widened the chasm between rich and poor at the expense of democracy. But I would contend too that there's been ways in which educators have misunderstood technology. The education system has also confused products for progress. It has conflated buying new technology with being progressive. Political progress, technological progress, progressive pedagogy. I think many in education have mistaken the tech industry's interest in education for a commitment to the future. And I think this has been a grave error. I think there has been almost near a total lack of accountability for these technology companies, the way they have damaged society, the way they have damaged and continue to damage education in particular. And now with AI, I think they are extending their power, they are consolidating their reach, and we are automating their unaccountability. I think their vision of the future is incredibly frightening. And I think in some ways it's just being legitimated by their great wealth. Otherwise, so much of what they talk about is just ridiculously silly if we stop and think about it. But because they are quite literally the richest man on the planet, we all have to listen to that. I went back, thinking about stories, thinking about the power of stories. And I think it's important to start thinking about and telling different stories. And one of my favorite authors is Ursula K. Le Guin, who a science fiction writer who just tells different stories about the future, not the stories that the tech billionaires seem to tell. And when she was accepting her speech for from the National Book Foundation, she said, "I think hard times are coming when we will be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, who can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine some real grounds for hope. We will need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art and begin in our art, the art of words." And I would say resistance and change begin in learning, right? And I think they begin in these sort of beautiful, fragile moments of discovery, just self-discovery, not just discovery of sort of new knowledge, self-discovery. They begin in this sort of precarious world, in the precarious situations, in a precarious institution. And I think if we are going to ensure and build alternative futures to the visions of Elon Musk and Donald Trump and Mark Zuckerberg, if we're going to build human futures, we have to think about protecting these very human spaces. I think we should not misunderstand that these tech oligarchs want to destroy democratic education. They want to destroy our freedom to think and choose. I mean, and this isn't just me being doomsayer. They have explicitly said so. They have explicitly stated that as our goal, as their goal. So we must understand our goal, our task, our responsibility is to one another, to humans, to humanity, and not to their machine. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. I'm on 2 devices, so trying to manage the video on one and this on the other. Thank you so much. This was, you're getting a lot of applause and hearts from everybody. And I want to open up for folks' questions. I'm seeing some really interesting comments in the chat, but none of them is explicitly a question. So I've kept them aside in case nobody starts asking questions, and I can let you know what people have been saying. Folks, you can either ask a question in the chat or raise your hands. And actually, I'm going to ask you to do something, even if you don't have a question, is say one thing in the chat right now. Tell us one thing that you learned from what Audrey said. Someone's already. Thank you for the fantastic. So happy to finally see a more critical take on AI and those who create it. Our mission as librarians is vastly different from those of the Silicon Valley tech companies, and we need to acknowledge it's tired of all the awe. Thank you. Looks like you're a sight for sore eyes, Audrey.
I've been thinking a lot about about awe, actually. And actually libraries, because I think one of the things, and this is so much broader than simply AI. Again, I think that AI is in some ways a symptom of what we've been building for quite some time, because I think, I think that there's something about awe and wonder, but about wonder, I guess, more than awe, about wondering that this world that the tech industry has built for us about instantaneous fulfillment does not leave space for wonder. And there's something about sitting in one's wonder, about like that. There's the verb and the noun. But like when you think I wonder, and you can sort of go to your pocket computer and immediately get an answer is a very it's just a sort of a different way of knowing and being in the world that doesn't really necessarily foster the kind of curiosity, extended curiosity and inquiry that I think about, that I think we thrive under. And I think about, so for me, the library is sort of an alternate model of that, where when you wonder something in the library, it's not sort of instantly, there's not that instant gratification. Perhaps you ask somebody for help. Perhaps you wander and wonder. That sort of sounds similar in English. But I think that there is the sort of slower, more thoughtful, more contemplative way in which inquiry and curiosity are built, that are these tools that are about efficiency and speed and getting you the right answer as fast as possible, have, I think, foreclosed the opportunity for us to really spend time with our thoughts. Everything becomes Googleable, or once upon a time it was Googleable. Now it's sort of, now the AI just gives us an automated answer. And I think that, for us all, but for students in particular, there's something so beautiful about wonder, but about sort of sitting with the wonder rather than being, I think, trained now that there must be an answer, that you must sort of look up instantly, and then you found out, and then you can sort of throw it away. It's just like another factoid, or everything just becomes it's a different kind of curiosity that doesn't, I think, get built upon as easily, because it's all just so instantaneous and really superficial.
Yeah. So we have a question that starts with "I wonder," which I thought is nice since that's what we were talking about. So Ali Bekir is saying, Hamoudi is saying, "I wonder how we can convey this critical understanding we have about AI to our students who have come to believe it is the future and sometimes believe it's more knowledgeable, useful than the educator, him or herself." That's a great question. Yeah, take that one.
That is a great question. And I find that kind of framework, which is how so much of this is being talked about in the media, as though our educational institutions are outmoded, that a professor's way of knowing, a professor's expertise, whether in terms of the content matter that they teach or their way of teaching, is somehow passé. I think that antagonism really towards education is built into a lot of the narratives that we're hearing about this. And I think students pick up these sort of cultural narratives. And I think that's significant, that things are being positioned as professors' old ways are no longer relevant, and that this new way is the future. I think, on the other hand, I think that once students are given sort of help to understand sort of a more critical approach, not simply like, here are the instructions on how to use technology, but once students understand sort of a critical approach, in my experience at least, they often they're horrified with why they haven't been taught this. But I think that students are quite receptive to this. One of the things, I think that there are lots of ways in which you can talk about this. You can talk about the environmental impacts, but I think that the biases built into it are particularly important for students to understand, with the generative AI in particular, that is, by and large, trained on the internet, the corpus of the internet. And so I think helping students to sort of imagine and think about what it would look like to build a system that's modeled on the kinds of answers that fill YouTube comments, right? When we build something on the corpus of the internet, not only are we building it on the past, so the kinds of biases from the past are being reinscribed into this technology. But there are particular kinds of biases based on whose words have been captured online. And so certain populations, certain beliefs are overrepresented in the corpus based on the internet. I mean, most obviously, English language is, this is a corpus, this intelligence is being built primarily on English language. It's being built because of extracting information from the internet. It's really overrepresents the voices of not just English speaking, but men, and not just men, but young men. Young white men are overrepresented as in the corpus. I think that this it also means that I think white supremacy, racist biases are overrepresented in the corpus. Lots of ways in which biases are then getting baked, sort of baked in, hard coded, if you will, into these systems. And I think students do understand that.
Yeah. If they have a foundation for what a bias is and how it can be harmful. And then
Yeah.
all of us here are outside the US. So whatever
Yeah.
the local culture you have there is, it's probably underrepresented. And when
Yeah.
ChatGPT or AI speaks your local language, it speaks it weirdly, maybe.
Yes.
I don't know if all the languages are the same, but Arabic is weird on ChatGPT a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's this idea, a lot of these stories that you hear of like perfect, that in the future, computers will sort of have perfect translation. I think any of us who sort of speak multiple languages understand that idea is so strange. I think that there is the sort of classic textbook way of foreign language translation, which I think a lot of it is sort of built on like how does a tourist go to another country and order a dinner. Maybe that works very well, but it certainly doesn't translate the poetry of everyday language. Is sort of in a way untranslatable, or certainly
Poetry and the politics. There's so much power.
not perfectly translatable in the sort of machine sort of imagination of sort of machine frictionless translation. I think we recognize that it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work that well.
There are two more questions. I'm going to say them together so that we have enough time to answer them. So one is from Evie, who's thanking you for the talk and saying, how can libraries help? Can you give us certain readings or voices who support this kind of view that we can share in our communities? And Caitlin Lucas is saying, how can we rewrite the story? A lot of people are familiar with the bias and environmental concerns for literacy efforts, but then how do we coordinate action to shape the future we want?
Yeah.
And something about Duolingo and elephants drinking milk.
Yeah, Duolingo is such a fascinating example of this. So I hope I can like tile this together. We'll see if I can. So the founder of Duolingo, Luis Van On, is actually also the founder of CAPTCHA, right? So I think we're all sort of familiar with the Google reCAPTCHA. Google bought his company many years ago that asks us to do the work of data labeling. It asks us, sort of user of the internet, to do data labeling. So you'll get shown several pictures, and you're asked in these photos, which of these is a picture of a bicycle. And it's a sort of ostensibly a way to verify if someone's human or not. But we are also doing the work when we use these CAPTCHAs of data labeling for Google's AI. They have outsourced their work to us, to the users of the internet, and we do their work for free. So common within the model of Silicon Valley to outsource the work to someone else, to either free or unpaid labor. And I think that that's important to remember, that AI is built on humans. This isn't some sort of magic smart machine. There is a lot of human labor that actually goes into the data labeling piece in particular. So Luis Van On, who founded Duolingo, had this idea of could he use the similar model, outsourcing this to users to translate the web. And so initially that's what Duolingo was going to be, would be showing people short sentences of things to verify, to do that sort of data labeling and verification of machine foreign language translation. But he found that actually, once you added a little bit, some behaviorist bells and whistles, that it actually became quite a sticky game. But there's not actually foreign language learning pedagogy built into Duolingo. At the outset, it was really, here is a tool, can we get the users to do little micro tasks of translation for free? And so unsurprisingly, Duolingo has been using a lot of AI and a lot of outsourced, low-paid contract labor to sort of build out its lessons. And I think that these are the things I think to think about. So there is such a powerful industry behind pushing these technologies, marketing this future to us. And so I think it's just worth thinking about when we hear these stories from this giant industry, to stop and think exactly what it is that is being sold to us by whom. And I think that, listening to the critical voices rather than simply rejecting these as and dismissing these, I think any critical voices right now are particularly important to listen to, because the power is so uneven. The power between sort of the vast power of the technology industry and also the sort of vast power of a very small handful of technology billionaires who, because of sort of this information infrastructure that they've built for us, that a lot of us ourselves are finding us in. So I think listening to the critical voices is incredibly important right now, because the power is just so the power is
Can you
so.
recommend particular names
Let's see.
for librarians to make sure the books are in our libraries?
Yeah, so I
Dan
think
Quillen?
Dan McQuillan is very interesting. Chris
I think
Gilliard,
that's how you write his name.
Chris Gilliard. Let me think. Emily Bender and Alex Hanna have a book out called The AI Con. It just came out last week. Kate Crawford, their book, The Atlas of AI, is interesting. Timnit Gebru, who raised a lot of these questions about large language models a while ago and was summarily fired from Google for doing so. I would say that she's always a good person to follow as
I missed the last one. What was the last one?
Timnit Gebru.
Of course, her podcast, there's a very good podcast that my students actually really like. So students will be like just one podcast by Timnit Gebru, and it makes a huge difference. I always misspell her name, but I'll try. I'll get it from online. Thank you, Audrey. So I'm not misspelling it then. I just always think I'm misspelling it. Okay, and Caitlin is also adding Ben Williamson and Felicitas McGilchrist. So I also like. Share a list later. We can put it on Connect if you guys want. I'm saving the chat, so we'll have the chat. And people wrote really nice things, Audrey. I'll send them to you about what stood out for them the most today. I know you like to see that. Yeah, we'll put the list on Connect with the recording and everything. Yes. And we can do reading groups around these if you want. And by the way, we will have reading groups in MyFest this year. So that's the mid-year festival. There's one that's going to be about Joy Bolamwini's book, also a really good person. She's one of the people who discovered about the facial recognition bias in AI. So there's some people who want to lead a book group around that. We can do reading groups around things like that. Okay, do we have other questions that we have not answered? If I've missed, I don't think I've missed anything, but it's possible. Sometimes people send something privately to someone else and they don't realize I haven't seen it. Audrey, you can stay for like 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes, right?
Yeah.
Or do you have to go? Okay. Oh, someone left their email address. I'm not sure. Okay, somebody said they recently probably yeah, I flipped classrooms, case of sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so this is a call for collaboration from others in AMICAL. Okay, I don't think the rest of things are questions, so that's fine. What can we in this group do other than teaching to fight against biases? Like, she's meaning like advocacy or activism. How can we engage computer science students also in this kind of discourse? These are 2 good questions, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Very action-oriented.
To Angie's question, I think that one of the things that is challenging about how a lot of things get framed right now is I think it's indicative of the world that we live in, that things often get framed in terms of choices that you make individual as a consumer, right? And so I think one can do that. One can make choices, for example, disinvest oneself from as many of these technologies as one can. One can sort of try to make individual choices. But I think at the end of the day, I think this is not simply about what we can do as consumers, as individuals, but it does require a shared collective intervention. And for better or for worse, I think that is through both activism, advocacy, and particularly through governmental regulation. I think that the tech companies are so powerful politically. They invest a lot of money in lobbying to sort of not just to avoid, but when there is regulatory influence, to shape regulation. But I do think that they have to sort of be, I think that there are many tools in the toolbox, so to speak. But I do think that there has to be stronger regulatory mechanisms. And some of that can actually be at the institutional level, right? So thinking about how does one regulate, maybe not regulate the industry, regulate a company, but what are the policies that one and practices that one can build out in one's institution. And I think, but I do think that shifting the burden onto it's somehow our individual responsibility is often the go-to. And I'm just sort of reluctant to introduce that and sort of to say that that's the way. I think we obviously individually can do a lot. We can work on our own biases. We can work to think about what our own consumption and technology practices and uses look like. But I think at the end of the day, that we just need to sort of regulate the hell out of this. And in the US in particular, I think tax the hell out of billionaires so there's no more technology billionaires. These last questions tend to sort of steer towards more and more radical. So we can wrap it up before I'm like, oh, the computer science. What can we do for computer science? I mean, I think that what's interesting about computer science as a field is that unlike other older sciences, is computer science a science anyway? Other older fields, computer science doesn't seem to do a very good job of understanding its own history. And I think that in some ways, perhaps that is an institutional responsibility, again, of educational institutions. How do we do a better job of introducing things into the core curriculum of what a computer science major would need to learn about, that isn't simply a bunch of classes on database management and programming languages, but are there ways in which we could sort of require the computer science major to sort of do more science and technology studies, to take classes on ethics, for example, to take classes on the history of their field, so that there is a bit like what other sciences do. Are there ways in which the computer science major can be changed so that that there is a recognition that this isn't simply about the code. The code does not exist outside the cultural context, right? And that they should always be thinking about humans and human institutions and human infrastructure, not just the infrastructure that they think that they're building.
I love that point about the code doesn't exist outside of cultural context. I don't think they teach anything about culture or context in computer science, which is what I studied as an undergrad.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And I think, unfortunately, I think that too often, particularly the kind of students who are admitted to some of the premier universities in the United States, the ones that are sort of the most competitive programs, Stanford, MIT, those students will have likely to have not taken any, when they graduate, likely to have not taken any classes in the humanities since they were high school students.
Well, we're all liberal arts institutions in this room, so they will have. But a
Yeah,
lot of times students feel like, oh, that's not relevant to my major, so I'll just, do whatever, get past this course.
yeah,
I don't know if outside of Egypt this is an issue, but at AUC, definitely. The engineering and computer science students don't always realize, or sometimes they realize after they graduate, oh, that was actually useful. But
yeah.
oh, you're getting very rewarding. You're getting, luckily we're liberal arts, but they're still the capitalist oppressive machine. But Angie makes sure her students know about that. All right. Thank you, everybody. Any last questions? Like one very last easy question? Okay, thank you, everyone. Well, Audrey, are you okay with us sharing this video with our students?
Absolutely.
In future
Absolutely.
semesters? All right,
Yes.
awesome. You guys have permission. Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this. I guess it's not me who turns off the recording, or maybe it is, I'm not sure. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Audrey. We are so privileged to have heard you speak.
Thank you for
I think, and we'll put the book we'll try to put the recommendations on Connect as well, not just the names of the authors. Like I'll help compile a list of all the authors that we talked about. And follow Audrey's blog because she's not just ranting on her opinion, she's always citing a lot of these really good authors all the time and linking you to their latest work. And sometimes it's their social media posts, so that's easier to share with students because it's like a 5-minute TikTok or Instagram or whatever, the kind of thing they actually watch or listen to. And then you can share the books with your faculty, maybe. Not the computer science ones, though. They probably want the TikTok too. No offense to anyone who's computer science. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Audrey.